The kitchen was filled with the sweet scent of cinnamon and baked apples, and the sound of my son's laughter resonated throughout the house as I turned off the oven timer. Sundays were our special tradition, just the two of us, a ritual I had held close since adopting Ethan, though he was unaware of the truth. To him, I was simply his mother, and that was all that mattered. I looked out the window, the pale December sunlight casting a soft glow over the frosted garden, and the memory of his tiny hand in mine when he was a toddler felt both near and distant, like a treasured photograph tucked away in a forgotten album. Ethan was now 19, tall, with broad shoulders and a quiet strength behind his easygoing smile. He had no idea how much of my heart he carried with him. The oven timer beeped, snapping me out of my thoughts. Ethan appeared in the doorway, his hair tousled and his sweater askew. "Smells amazing, Mom," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "You're just saying that because you're hungry," I teased, pulling the apple pie from the oven. He laughed, that warm, boyish sound that always made me smile, guilty as charged. It was moments like these that I cherished most, though they also reminded me of the emptiness that his presence had filled. My husband, David, had left years ago, after the doctors confirmed what I had already feared: I couldn't have children. That marked the beginning of my unraveling. But while David saw a failure, I saw an opportunity to rebuild, and Ethan had become the thread that mended my life. As we sat down at the table, Ethan's phone buzzed, but he ignored it and gave me his full attention. "Any plans for the day?" I asked. "Yeah, just working on a project," he replied, running a hand through his hair. "Maybe go for a run later. What about you?" "The usual, maybe reorganize the attic." "Need help?" he asked. I shook my head. "We've got it. You focus on your schoolwork." But the truth was, I wanted the attic to myself. The dusty boxes contained memories I wasn't ready to share, secrets I feared would unravel the life we had built. Ethan was my son in every way that mattered, but a part of me always wondered what he would feel if he knew the truth. Would he see me differently? Would he feel betrayed? Later that afternoon, I climbed the creaky stairs to the attic, the cold biting at my fingers as I pulled the chain to turn on the light. The familiar scent of aged paper and wood surrounded me, and I began sorting through the boxes: photos, baby clothes, adoption papers, mementos of a life I had carefully pieced together. I found a photo of Ethan as a baby, his big blue eyes staring up at the camera. My chest tightened. I had fallen in love with him the moment I saw him, bundled up in the adoption agency's nursery. The social worker had warned me that he might be a difficult child, born prematurely to a young mother with no resources and no plans to return. But to me, Ethan had been perfect. "Mom!" A voice startled me, nearly causing me to drop the photo. Ethan stood in the doorway, his brow furrowed. "What are you doing up here?" "Just going through some old things," I said, setting the photo down. He stepped closer, curiosity in his eyes. "Can I help?" "No," I replied more sharply than I intended, and softened my tone. "I mean, it's just boring stuff. You'd hate it." He didn't move, his gaze drifting to the box beside me. "What's in there?" My heart raced as he reached for it. "Ethan, please. He froze, concern crossing his face. What's going on? I opened my mouth but couldn't find the words. How could I explain the weight of my silence? How could I tell him the truth without breaking us both? Instead, I smiled weakly. It's just old papers, memories I haven't looked at in years. Ethan studied me for a moment before nodding. Okay, he said. But as he left, I saw the shadow of doubt in his eyes. That night, as I stood in the doorway of his room, watching him study, I felt a familiar ache of guilt. He deserved to know the truth, but fear kept me rooted in place. I turned away and retreated to my own room, where the photo of baby Ethan sat on my nightstand. I traced the edges of the frame, my mind swirling with memories. I thought of David's departure, how he packed his things in silence, leaving behind only an echo of what our marriage had been. I thought of the adoption process, the sleepless nights, the joy of Ethan's first steps. But most of all, I thought of the promise I had made to myself the day I brought him home, that I would love him unconditionally, no matter what. And so, I kept my secret for now. Ethan was my son, and someday, when the time was right, I would tell him everything. But tonight, I would let myself believe in the simple, unspoken bond that tied us together, a bond stronger than blood, built on love and trust. For now, that was enough. As the days grew shorter and winter settled in, the world outside felt muffled by the blanket of snow. Inside our home, a new rhythm had begun to take shape. Ethan and I spent more time together, sharing quiet evenings filled with movies, cooking experiments, and laughter that warmed the space between us. I tried to ignore the way I noticed him now, the way his jaw set when he focused, the way his smile reached his eyes. These were things a mother shouldn't dwell on, yet they lodged themselves in my mind like stubborn thorns. Movie night, Ethan called from the living room one evening. Only if I get to pick, I replied, grabbing a blanket from the hall closet. He groaned dramatically. It's fine, but if this turns out to be another dull drama, I'm just making popcorn as a distraction, I chuckled, settling down on the couch while he sank down beside me. You need to broaden your tastes. Not everything has to be packed with explosions to be good, he teased, casting a playful look at me. Explosions make everything better. We fell into a comfortable silence as the movie started, the soft glow of the screen casting a warm light over his face. Somewhere between the opening credits and the climax, I felt the weight of his arm drape casually over the back of the couch. It was familiar, relaxed, but when his fingers brushed my shoulder, my heart skipped a beat. I told myself it was nothing, just a distracted gesture, but the warmth of his touch lingered, stirring thoughts I wasn't ready to entertain. I shifted a bit, pretending to adjust the blanket, and his arm slipped away. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught him glancing at me, a fleeting, unreadable expression crossing his face. You okay, Mom? His voice was soft, unsure. I nodded quickly. Of course, just getting comfortable. He didn't press further, but the silent tension between us hung in the air like static. When the credits began to roll, I faked a yawn. Bedtime for me, I said, standing up and folding the blanket. Don't stay up too late. Night, Mom, he replied, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer than usual. The next morning, Ethan surprised me with an unexpected effort to help around the house on a Saturday. We spent the morning sorting through the garage, a task that turned into more laughter than actual progress as we uncovered old mementos. "Hey, check this out," he said, holding up a faded photo of me from my college days. "You were kind of a babe, Mom." I rolled my eyes, grabbing the photo from him. "Thanks." "Seriously, though," he laughed, leaning on the workbench. "It's weird thinking of you being my age once, like you've always just been." "Mom," I paused, the words catching in my throat. I wanted to tell him the truth about how our lives had come together, to explain everything, but the moment felt fragile, and I didn't want to ruin it. Instead, I smiled. "Well, believe it or not, I wasn't always a middle-aged lady. I had my wild days." "Oh, now I have to hear about them." "Not a chance," I laughed, swatting at him with the photo. He dodged, grinning. "Fine, keep your secrets." If only he knew. By evening, the garage was at least somewhat tidier, and I rewarded our efforts with takeout. We sat at the kitchen table, the soft hum of the heater in the background. Ethan's phone buzzed next to his plate, and he glanced at the screen before silencing it. "Not going to answer?" "No, it's nothing," he said, shrugging. "Just a friend." I studied him for a moment, noticing a slight flush in his cheeks. "Girlfriend tease?" He shook his head quickly. "No, nothing like that. I don't really do the whole dating thing." "Oh." I tried to sound casual, but the unexpected relief that flooded me made my stomach twist. "It just feels complicated." His gaze met mine and held for a moment too long. "Some people are worth it, though." The room suddenly felt smaller, the space between us charged with an unspoken tension. I broke eye contact, reaching for my glass of water. "Well, when you do meet someone, make sure she's good enough for you." "Or he," Ethan said lightly, teasing. I raised an eyebrow, hiding a smile. "Or he." The tension melted into laughter, but the moment lingered, quietly weaving itself into my thoughts. That night, I found myself awake long after Ethan had gone to bed. The house was still except for the faint creaks of the old wood settling in the cold. I wandered downstairs, the soft light of the moon spilling through the windows. Ethan's door was slightly open, and I paused, peeking inside. He was asleep, his face calm and serene in the dim light. My chest tightened as I watched him, a rush of emotions I couldn't name threatening to overwhelm me. He wasn't my biological son, but in every meaningful way, he was mine. Yet, as I stood there, I couldn't deny the shift in our relationship, the way my heart reacted to him now in ways it shouldn't. I quickly turned away, retreating to my room, pressing a hand to my chest. This was wrong. These feelings were wrong. I had spent years building a life for Ethan, protecting him, loving him as my son. But somewhere along the way, the lines had blurred, and I had no idea how to fix it. The next morning, Ethan caught me staring out the kitchen window, a hot cup of coffee in my hands. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft with concern. I forced a smile. "Just thinking about life." I paused, then shrugged. "You, me." He nodded. "You're growing up so fast, Ethan. Feels like just yesterday I was teaching you how to tie your shoes." He smiled, but there was a softness in his expression that made my heart ache. "I wouldn't be who I am without you, Mom." The weight of his words hung heavy, and I felt the sting of tears threatening to fall. I turned away, busying myself with the dishes. "You've always been enough, Ethan," I said quietly, more to myself than to him. But the truth was, I wasn't sure I was enough anymore. Days turned into weeks, and winter gradually shifted into the first signs of spring. Ethan's laughter filled the house more often than ever, and our connection grew in ways I hadn't expected. He began seeking me out, not just for casual conversations, but for something more, for the company of comfort. It initially felt subtle, a lingering gaze over dinner, or the way he'd brush past me in the kitchen. His presence, a mix of warmth, both overwhelming and confusing. I struggled to suppress my emotions. One quiet evening, we sat together on the couch, the dim light of a movie flickering on the screen. He leaned closer, his arm brushing against mine, and I could feel the heat of him, the rhythm of his breath, steady and close. My heart raced as I stared ahead, trying to distract myself from the closeness between us. "Mom," he whispered softly, his voice barely audible. "Are you okay?" I nodded quickly. Of course, why wouldn't I be? "You've seemed different lately," he observed, turning to face me. His eyes searched mine, filled with concern and something deeper, something I couldn't name. Distant, I tried to smile, but it faltered under his gaze. "I'm fine, Ethan." "Really?" He didn't seem convinced, but he didn't push further. Instead, he reached out, his fingers brushing mine. It was a small gesture, but it sent a jolt through me, a connection that was both terrifying and comforting. The truth weighed heavier on me each day. The adoption papers hidden in the attic, like a ticking time bomb, I knew I couldn't ignore much longer. I loved Ethan more than anything, but I also knew that the growing closeness between us needed clarity before it became something neither of us could handle. One evening, as the sun set and bathed the house in golden light, I found him in the living room. He was sitting by the window, his long legs stretched out, a book resting on his lap. When he saw me, his face lit up with that smile that always made my chest ache. "Hey," he said, closing the book. "What's up?" I hesitated, my hands trembling as I gripped the back of the chair for support. "Ethan, we need to talk." He frowned, sitting up straight. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," I said quickly, though my throat tightened with emotion. "It's just, there's something I've been meaning to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." His brow furrowed, and he leaned forward, his attention fully on me. "What is it?" I took a deep breath, the words heavy in my chest. "You're adopted." The silence that followed was deafening. At first, his expression didn't change, as if he hadn't fully grasped what I'd said. Then, slowly, his eyes widened, his mouth opening slightly. "Adopted," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. I nodded, tears welling up in my eyes. "You've always been my son, Ethan. From the moment I held you, you were mine. But I wasn't the one who gave birth to you." He stared at me, shock and disbelief written on his face. "Why? Why didn't you tell me?" "I was scared," I admitted, my voice shaking. "I didn't want you to feel like you weren't enough. I didn't want you to feel separate. You're my son in every way that matters." He turned away, his jaw tight, and my heart shattered at the sight. I moved to sit beside him, reaching for his hand, but he didn't respond. "Ethan," I whispered, "please say something." He turned back to me, and to my surprise, his eyes were filled with unshed tears. "You're the only mom I've ever known," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That hasn't changed." Relief washed over me, and I let out a shaky breath. But then he added, "It does explain some things, though." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart pounding. He hesitated, his eyes locking with mine. "The way I've felt about you lately, it's different." The air between us thickened, charged with unspoken truths. I swallowed hard, my hands trembling in my lap. "Ethan, you're my son." "I know," he said quickly, his voice rising. "And I love you, but not just as a son. I don't think I've ever loved you that way. Not completely." "Ethan," I whispered, my voice breaking. "This is wrong," he interrupted, his eyes searching mine. "I don't know, maybe it is, but I can't help how I feel." My chest tightened, a storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm me. "You don't mean that." "I do," he said firmly, his gaze unwavering, "and I think you feel it too." I looked away, unable to meet his eyes. The truth was too raw, too dangerous to admit. "Ethan, this is complicated." "Complicated doesn't mean it's not real," he said softly. "Mom, I've never felt this way about anyone, and I don't think I ever will." Tears spilled down my cheeks as I turned back to him, my heart breaking under the weight of his words. "I love you, Ethan, more than you'll ever know. But this—" He reached for my hand, his touch gentle but firm. "We'll figure it out together," he said. I shook my head, my tears falling freely now. "You're my son," I said again, as if the words could undo what we both felt. "And you're my everything," he whispered. For a long moment we sat in silence, the world outside fading away. I had no idea what the future might bring, or how we would handle the impossible situation we were in. But as I gazed into his eyes, I saw the same love, the same yearning that had been building between us for weeks. For the first time, I allowed myself to wonder if love, despite its complications, could be enough. As the night unfolded, I stayed close to him, holding his hand, knowing that whatever came our way, we would face it together. The days that followed felt like a delicate dance, each move carefully considered but filled with emotions neither of us fully grasped. Ethan's behavior subtly shifted, but it was undeniable, and I couldn't ignore the warmth his actions brought me. It began with small gestures, the way he lingered in the kitchen after breakfast, his fingers brushing lightly against mine as he reached for a plate, or how he held my gaze just a bit longer than usual. His compliments became more frequent, starting with innocent remarks about my cooking or how warm and welcoming the house felt. But there was a new tone to his voice, a depth that made my cheeks flush. One morning, as I stood by the window sipping my coffee, Ethan approached me from behind. I felt his presence, before I saw him the subtle warmth of him filling the space between us. "Morning, Mom," he said softly, his voice carrying an unfamiliar tenderness. "Morning," I replied, my voice catching slightly. "I don't think I've told you how beautiful you look when the light hits you like this," he said, his words so gentle they felt like a caress. I froze, unsure how to respond, my heart racing, caught between flattery and confusion. I turned to face him, searching his expression for any sign of jest, but his eyes were steady and sincere. "Ethan," I began, but he cut me off with a warm smile. "I mean it," he said. "You're stunning, Mom. You always have been." His words stayed with me long after he left for his morning run. No one had spoken to me like that in years, not since David had left. It was as if Ethan saw me not only as a mother, but as a woman with her own beauty and worth. Though it frightened me, it also sparked something inside me that I hadn't felt in ages, the desire to be seen. That evening, he brought home flowers, my favorite kind. I blinked in surprise as he handed them to me, his smile sheepish yet proud. "What's this for?" I asked, holding the bouquet to my chest. "Just because," he said with a shrug, though the warmth in his gaze betrayed the simplicity of his words. I busied myself arranging the flowers in a vase, my hands trembling slightly. Ethan leaned against the counter, watching me with an intensity that made my cheeks burn. "You deserve to be spoiled," he said in a low voice. "You do so much for me, for us. It's time someone did something for you." His words were like honey sweet and soothing, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "Thank you," I murmured, unable to meet his gaze. "That's very kind of you." "It's not kindness," he replied, stepping closer. "It's the truth." As the days went on, his affection became more tangible. He began helping with chores I'd long grown used to doing alone. He fixed the squeaky door in the hallway without me asking, took over cleaning the gutters, and insisted on carrying the groceries from the car even when they were light. His touches grew more frequent too, a kiss on the cheek as he passed me in the kitchen, his hand brushing mine when we sat together on the couch, or the way his hugs lingered, his arms holding me with a quiet strength that made me feel safe. I couldn't deny the comfort his presence brought me, nor the warmth that spread through my chest when he was near. One afternoon, I was sitting on the porch, reading, with the early spring sun warming the air. Ethan came outside, carrying 2 mugs of tea. He handed me one and sat beside me, his shoulder brushing mine. "Reading anything good?" he asked playfully. "Just an old favorite," I replied, holding up the novel. He glanced at the cover and smiled. "You've always loved that one." "Of course, I remember everything about you," he said. His words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. I glanced at him, my heart pounding, as his eyes met mine. The intensity of his gaze made me feel exposed, as if he could see every thought and feeling I tried so hard to hide. "Ethan," I began, but the words caught in my throat. He reached out, taking my hand in his. "You don't have to say anything," he said softly. "I just want you to know how much you mean to me, how much I appreciate you." I nodded, unable to speak, and he lifted my hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to my knuckles. The tenderness of the gesture sent a shiver down my spine, and I quickly pulled my hand away, setting the mug down to busy myself. By now, it was undeniable that our relationship had changed. Ethan's affection extended beyond the typical mother-son bond, and although I tried to convince myself it was harmless, I knew it wasn't. Still, I couldn't bring myself to push him away. His presence filled a void I hadn't even realized existed, and the thought of losing his warmth, his attention, was unbearable. One evening, as I stood at the stove preparing dinner, Ethan came up behind me. He placed his hands gently on my shoulders, his touch firm yet soothing. "Long day?" he asked, his voice close to my ear. "A little," I admitted, my breath hitching as his fingers began to knead the tension in my shoulders. "You do too much," he murmured, his hands moving in slow, deliberate circles. "You should let me take care of you for a change." His words sent a rush of warmth through me, and I closed my eyes, allowing myself to savor the moment. "Ethan, you don't have to." "I want to," he said firmly. "You've done everything for me. You've given me a life, a home, love. It's my turn to give back." I turned to face him, his hand slipping to rest on my arms. His expression was earnest, his eyes filled with an intensity that made my chest tighten. "You're my world, Mom," he said softly, his voice trembling slightly, "and I'll do whatever it takes to make you happy." Tears welled up in my eyes as I looked at him, my emotions a swirling storm of love, fear, and longing. I reached up, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead, my hand lingering there longer than it should have. "You've already made me happy," I whispered, my voice breaking. For a moment, the world stood still as we gazed at each other, the air between us thick with unspoken feelings. Slowly, he leaned forward, pressing a soft kiss to my cheek. His lips lingered for a heartbeat too long, and when he pulled back, his eyes searched mine, as if waiting for permission. I didn't know what to say, what to do. All I knew was that Ethan had become more than just my son. He was my everything,